basically a pattern is, as it says there, it's some kind of a reliable sample or a reliable example of some kind of trait or some kind of behavior. Usually what makes a pattern, something a pattern, is that it's repeatable. We say it's a pattern because we see that it's repeatable. And that's one of the first things, by the way, that distinguishes pattern finding from elicitation. When you're doing elicitation and you ask somebody a question and they give you an answer, you just accept their answer. You don't question, does it repeat, does it happen every time? In pattern finding, one of the first things that you're noticing is something can't, we used to always say, something can't happen once and be a pattern. How do you know if it's a pattern if it's only happened once? Pattern is actually something that has to have happened at least, usually we say, one is a possibility, two is a suggestion. Okay, well maybe this is if I've seen it twice. By the time you get three, then you're starting to go, oh, well maybe this is a pattern. So something has to occur regularly to be a pattern. So I think that's one key thing about patterns. When you detect patterns, there's a couple of things that are important about it, which is, number one, the number of points in the pattern. The number of points means how many different things are linked together in the pattern. So for example, I might notice that somebody's eyes go up. Well, that's only 1 point, right? But if I notice that their eyes go up, they use a certain predicate, and then they make a certain gesture, that's 3 points, right? The eye movement, the words, and the gesture. So the number of points in the pattern determines how complex the pattern is. Again, it's how many things you're putting together. Then, is it simultaneous or sequential? So if I have those 3 points, the eye movement, the words, and the gesture, do they happen all at once, or do they happen one after the other? So that's another thing that you're kind of noticing, is the pattern that I've observed, how many pieces are in it, and then is it happening over time or is it happening all at once? Number 3 then is which channel is the pattern? Is it visual? Is it and how does it come out? Sometimes, as you get beyond the logical level of behaviors, as you get to a pattern at the capability or belief level, you're not going to be able to observe the belief directly. You can't observe a capability, a mental process directly. You can only observe the cues of that mental process. So sometimes what you're doing is you're finding one pattern by noticing other patterns. Meaning I see a bunch of behaviors as a pattern, and that tells me that there must be some kind of a belief going on. So you're deriving one from another. And then finally, the source of the pattern. A pattern is not only within one person. It might be one thing that if every time I look up, I say a certain word and make a gesture. But let's say the pattern is that every time somebody else looks up, I say the word, make the gesture. So now what I've got is a slightly more complex pattern, because I will only say the word if that person looks up. So now I've got to look for what's going on between 2 people or 3 people, not just what's happening in one person. And so that can be kind of interesting, a little bit. It's part of where the challenges of modeling come in, because many of the things that you're going to want to model, especially in a business context or an organizational context, are not just happening within one person. They're happening in interaction between somebody and somebody else, or a group of people and another group. So your modeling actually has to, and your coaching has to actually be able to address what we call multi-source patterns, as well as multi-point patterns. So those are just some of the kind of things that I think are in the background here, and will be part of what we're going to be practicing and building up to in the next, in the coming days. But before we actually go into the drill, there's one thing that's going to be important to know before we start. And this important thing to know is how to not know. So we're going to do a little bit of knowing how to not know. And actually on page 29, so as it says here, just to underscore a few things, it says the state of not knowing is a special state used for modeling and information gathering in NLP. That means yes, it's modeling, but also sometimes when you're gathering information in a coaching session, you want to not know. One of the big problems that we often have in gathering information from others is that we are already bringing our assumptions and our presuppositions into that interaction. So let's say you're coaching somebody who's a CEO or an executive, and you bring in a bunch of assumptions about what executives are like, you know. And you know what happens is that you're not actually going to even see the real person there. You're going to miss things. This is the whole thing, you know, Bandler and Grinder talked about, deletion, distortion, generalization, because I'm more or less seeing my model of who they are rather than who they are. So the state of not knowing is important. It's about having a clear state, a lack of assumptions. There's an old saying that when you assume, that to assume makes an ass of you and me. So ass of you and me. So what part of what you want to do then is to be able to go into a state where you can drop your assumptions. As it says here, you know, it's like having a fresh and unbiased perspective. When you drop your assumptions, it means that you're not, I mean, this is that whole thing about avoiding generalization, deletion, distortion. And one of the ways that you do that is to kind of go into a state of not knowing. One of the challenges that we often find with people who are both coaches and modelers is that they want to know right away. That people, it's actually one of the things, especially with modeling, we find that's the biggest challenge is that people have a very difficult time, some people, to not knowing. That is, it's almost intolerable for them to not know or to not understand. So they're trying to rush to find the pattern. They're trying to rush to get knowledge, rather than sort of waiting for a bit and kind of being like, one of the things, I think it's one of the reasons that children learn so fast is that they're comfortable with not knowing. They don't have to have the answer. They don't have to be in charge all the time. They can kind of wait. And so not knowing is an important part of that. And in fact, both, Milton Erickson, well, I have three examples here, Albert Einstein, Milton Erickson, Moshe Feldenkrais. Einstein said that many of his ideas came because he asked himself about space and time without any preconception. So many of us think we already know what space and time is. We just assume there's time. And Einstein would drop all of his assumptions about time and say, what is it, really? I mean, everybody else will go, what are you, stupid? Everybody knows what time is. Everybody knows what space is. It's obvious. But Einstein would ask those kind of fundamental questions. The same was true with Erickson. When Erickson, he often talked about when a client would come in, he would put all of his presuppositions aside. And, so one of the things I'm going to be kind of asking you to practice, and I know, the reason we do this is that I know that in talking with Judy and John Grinder and Richard Bandler and all the people, from many years of doing modeling, that this is a state that we all recognize. It's a state where you kind of go in and it's like you're completely open. No assumptions, you're just taking in. I think sometimes in coaching people call that deep listening. Deep listening is sort of listening without all the chatter, without all of the structures, trying to force the person into a particular, trying to figure out, which technique am I going to use now? That problem is, you're not really then listening. You're kind of missing a lot of what the client is offering you. Kind of what we're saying is that in times of observation, we used to, in the early days of NLP, we talked about the difference between uptime and downtime. Uptime meant you were in a state of getting information in, and downtime meant you were in the state of thinking about it. Uptime is an observation where you don't want to be projecting out. You don't want to be mind reading. In fact, in the early days of NLP was the time when all of these Carlos Castaneda books were out. They were about the teachings of the Don Juan, the Native American. He talked about being he was a Yaqui Indian from Mexico, and they was always talking about this warrior's path, and one of the things that they often talked about, and Bandler and Grinder were very much into this whole notion of the Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan experience. And they talked about a special state that they called stopping the world. And stopping the world basically meant stopping internal dialogue. And so in observation, you don't want to be mind reading in the sense of projecting yourself in there. The idea is to kind of quiet in your internal dialogue. In a sense, you also enter a calm state because you don't want to project out your emotions either. And so I think that the balance is that at the times when you're taking in information, you're not trying to make sense of it. I mean, mind reading comes when you're trying to make sense out of it. Mind reading only makes sense, or imagination only makes sense if you're trying to structure something, understand it, do something with it, right? So this is not a time where you're doing anything with it. You're sort of opening, being quiet, and letting something come in. And then you can use your imagination and everything else to try to structure it, understand it, organize it. So I think that is definitely the balance. So often, people imbalance in the other way. They're just constantly out there, asking questions with already their understanding of the answer, in mind. So this ability to not need to rush to a solution, to not need to rush to understanding what the other person is saying or what's going on with them. And so it's not like you have, and again, it's a little bit of trusting. Actually, this state of not knowing involves a state of trust that you will get something. The answer will be there. And actually, trust is often what allows people to wait just a little bit longer. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the world between whether you get a really powerful model or powerful solution and a kind of a, well, it's quick, but not very effective.